It will the recording will be available after the session, and the slides as well, so they'll be posted during the session. This is a very casual session. We want to make sure that our guest speaker has time to share all of her information. But if you have questions while she's speaking, you are welcome to enter them in what's called the Q&A. So if you look on your screen, it's either at the top or the bottom. You'll see two little bubbles, look just like the chat. The Q&A has two bubbles. That's where you want to pop your questions into. The chat is actually not working for you right now. It helps us to be able to just monitor that Q&A. In the chat, what you will find is Melissa, one of our team members, is going to pop links and phone numbers, those kinds of things, so you can grab them for a quick, easy download for that information. So Beth, you want to go to the next slide and I'll introduce our guest speaker. All right, so I want you to give a warm welcome to our guest speaker, Becky Stamler. So Becky graduated from UNC Charlotte with a master's degree in counseling. She is a licensed clinical mental health counselor with North Carolina, and her primary focus is gender therapy, supporting LGBTQ people seeking affirmative therapy related to gender identity and sexual orientation, gender therapy, and gender transition. Becky is a co-founding member of the Charlotte Transgender Healthcare Group for best professional practices, referrals, education, and consultation. And so I am going to let Becky share her slides. Becky's going to give us basically a transgender 101, going to give us some great information on how we can work together with individuals we support, maybe individuals you know in your personal life. So I am going to let Becky take it from here.
Thank you, Anne. Can you all hear me okay? Terrific. Okay, today I have come to talk to everybody about the basics of understanding gender identity. I call it Transgender 101. It's starter information to help understand folks who are questioning their gender identity or have already identified themselves as transgender, gender nonconforming, or perhaps non-binary. So let me begin. Oh, it's not moving. Oh, hello, I got it. So the terminology in it can be very different and very diverse related to the transgender population, whether it's for words that are, or terms that are used regionally, like West Coast versus East Coast, or colloquially within the community, clinical, like terminology used by professionals, whether mental health, medical health, or otherwise, as well as academic communities like universities and professors doing research. So these are examples of some of the language, transgender being kind of an umbrella term, while other terminology has been used in the past, some of it has kind of faded to the wayside, such as transsexual is not used as often. That's another example. So one term that's good to know is binary, meaning that someone might identify as male or they might identify as female. Questioning might mean that somebody's still trying to figure it out. For some reason, they may not have known this since they were 2 years old, or although I've had clients who have known since they were 2 years old. Sometimes it takes something, an event like puberty, to hammer it home and be like, whoa, this isn't right, or this is confusing, or even upsetting. So there's a lot of leeway there. M to F or F to M is often used in research by academics or in clinical standards. Two-spirit is a term used in tribal lands for indigenous folks, for someone who is in touch with both male and female side. Gender variant is another term used. Gender nonconforming, gender queer, non-binary for people who may not necessarily identify strictly as male or female. Gender fluid for people who might identify with both aspects of male and female. The terms cross-dresser may not be, some consider it trans, some do not. It's actually a little controversy in some communities. And then people who do drag shows as a drag queen or a drag king may not even be transgender at all. Although I have had some transgender clients who do drag shows in order to raise funds to help pay for some of their treatment. And then a person who identifies as intersex, I'm going to cover this in a second, but they may not be trans at all, but in mental health, sometimes we don't have a diagnosis in our book for intersex people because it's not a mental health condition. It's basically has to do with birth and what happens at birth. So I will say this. Hold on, let me get rid of something. There we go. Something was covering it on my end. Okay, so the first, I'm going to talk about 3 areas of gender identity and that is important to know about folks who identify as transgender or non-binary. And so the first one used to be called biological, but today it's much more known as sex assigned at birth. And what I mean by that, today, that is that there is now a new diagnostic manual for mental health people, the DSM-5 TR, meaning it's been revised. So a lot of language is updated for a lot of mental health disorders and conditions. So some of the terminology they use, it might sound different, but then again, we don't always, clinical terms doesn't always make sense to some people. And it's helpful if we can explain anything that sounds confusing or never heard of that before. So the first set of information I'd like to discuss related to gender identity is the sex a person is assigned at birth. In other words, when the doctor sees a baby, they can usually look at the visible organs and body and do testing for organs, chromosomes, and hormone makeup, body DNA, so on and so forth, to assign a gender at birth. So on the left side is female with the chromosomes XX. On the far right side is male with the chromosomes XY. And then in the center is intersex, which can be various combinations of the XXY on a 47th chromosome, and can indicate internal or external features that a person uses biologically or is just how our body looks, makes up how our body looks. So the sex assigned at birth is where we start. I will give myself as an example. I was assigned female at birth based on what the doctor saw. There we go. The next slide is about gender identity. And gender identity has to do with what you know about yourself, what a person thinks and knows about their body, body chemistry, and how you might interpret what gender means. Sounds kind of broad, I know. But let me talk about this spectrum on this slide. And so on the far left-hand side it will talk on above the spectrum, above the line. It talks about being woman, and on the other side, it talks about being man. So that's gender identity on the binary. There's two in binary, woman and man. If, like me, you were assigned female at birth and you know yourself to be a woman, then you would be cisgender. And cis is one of those kind of, I think it's a Latin term meaning same. So it basically means I identify as the same gender I was assigned at birth, cisgender. Same thing on the other side for a man who identifies as a man and was assigned male at birth, they would be a cisgender man. Now the terminology under the line has to do with a common terminology used for transgender folks, but is not limited to just this terminology because there's not always room on the slide for everything. So for someone who is born male and identifies as female, they might identify as a trans girl or a trans woman, of course, depending on someone's age. Clinical term, it might be M to F. On the far right side, someone who is born female and identifies as male could identify as a trans boy or a trans man. Clinical term being F to M, or female to male in transition. Now in the center, for people who don't identify on the binary, on either end of man, male or female, man or woman, then they would be non-binary. This started becoming much more talked about like 6 or so years ago when the first person who walked in my office and I started talking to them about what their issues are and what they want to work on, they talked about being non-binary. And I was like, oh, I haven't heard that before. So it has become a long, each year attending trainings and talking to people in the community related to what that means. I find it can sometimes mean something different to each person I talk to that identifies as non-binary, that some people were assigned female at birth and they know that's not it, but they're not sure if they would identify totally as a trans man. But they know they're not a girl that they were assigned at birth. Wow, that's a lot. So in the center, non-binary, someone could also identify as gender fluid. This also has had many descriptions from clients to me, but a lot of times has to do with being able to identify in both masculine and feminine or male and female understanding of myself. Someone who is genderqueer, that has had a different explanation every time I've asked somebody, well, tell me more about what that means to you, because I want to understand you better. And has just, it's similar to kind of gender fluid, but also might include sexuality, but not really. You know, the more they talk about it, sometimes the more vague it sounded, and sometimes people got very specific with it. So I think some of this terminology is dependent upon the individual you're working with and who you're talking to. Agender might be for someone who doesn't identify in any gender as male or female. I just don't, none of that seems to indicate who I am. And then gender nonconforming, also some words that are used for someone to describe who they are. If that sounds too specific, or too vague, right, then you're with me. Because as I've worked with individuals, no two transitions have really been totally the same and as unique as the individuals I have worked with. But for this spectrum's purpose, gender identity is who a person knows themselves to be. And it's important to listen to them when they tell you this. Because if they're telling you this, then you have gained some trust in a person who might be shaking in their boots to even say that to somebody else. And then there are some folks who are like, yeah, that's who I am. Let's just go. Let's move on. So let me go on to the next slide. Gender expression is the third spectrum that I'd like to talk about related to gender identity itself. And gender expression is basically how a person presents or demonstrates their gender to themselves, to others, and that could be through traditional gender roles of masculine and feminine. It can be related to a hairstyle, clothes that a person likes to wear, anything about appearance. It could also do with certain behaviors or hand gestures or body language, as well as interactions with others, and is defined mostly by the person themselves. So on each end of this spectrum, someone might define their expression as feminine. Some might explain their gender expression as masculine. And then in the center, someone is not necessarily on the binary. It might be that someone is gender fluid. I had one client who would wear the dark black Doc Marten boots with black socks and a mini skirt. And sometimes they would wear a camo army shirt, and sometimes they'd wear a lovely blouse. Their expression was fluid and sometimes involved one gender or the other or both mixed together. And then someone who might have an androgynous gender expression. It might not even really relate to any specific gender. A concert t-shirt, for example. Although there's t-shirts that have different cuts, aren't there? There's like that crew neck, and then there's the scoop neck and the off the shoulder thingy, and then the little bands on their arms. So, gender expression can be what speaks to you, what is you, what helps put you out there. And for some people, it takes them a while to figure that out. And some people show up to the office in their favorite outfit, maybe even with purple hair or green hair or spiked hair or long hair and a ponytail or braid, it's all how a person wants to express themselves. Oops, hello. And then I'm showing the slide about sexual orientation because a lot of people might confuse gender identity and sexual orientation. After all, a lot of times people will put together LGBTQ. Isn't it all the same? Not necessarily, not really. Gender identity has to do with how I identify myself related to gender, pretty much. Sexual orientation has a lot more to do with attraction to others. And that could be, that would be based on their sex or gender in relation to yours. And it can be physical attraction, emotional attraction, sexual attraction, or romantic attraction, or any combination of those, or all of them. On the left side of the spectrum for sexual orientation might be heterosexual, which is really more of a clinical term. The more colloquially colloquial or common term is straight, whereas on the right side, homosexual would be a clinical term, whereas lesbian or gay might be more of the common term or colloquial. In the center, not on the binary, would be bisexual. Someone who might be attracted to both men and women in relationship to their gender identity. Someone might identify as asexual, meaning that they may not act on a sexual attraction. It might be simply a romantic attraction or physical or emotion. Physical meaning without sexuality. And then there are some folks who identify as pansexual, meaning that they can be attracted to the person, whether they are male or female, whether they are a transgender man, a transgender woman, or someone who's non-binary. Okay, so to put all of that in a nutshell, here's the nutshell slide that shows the top 3 spectrum for gender identity, and then the bottom one is related to sexual orientation. And the reason I group all of these together is to show that as in many aspects of society, there is a dominant culture, often in many aspects of culture. So when it comes to sex assigned at birth, the one that says male has a little asterisk next to it. And often people will say this is a male dominated culture, this is a man's world, men make this much, women makes, what is it now, 70 cents on the dollar that every man makes, or that in general, that this is a male dominated society. And in gender identity, cisgender people often are in the dominant culture. And if you listen to anything on television, the majority of the time, it's related to cisgender culture. Although this month, there's a whole lot of stuff about trans people, gay people, lesbian people, bisexuals, because it's Gay Pride Month. But that is often not the norm. Very often there will be shows related to not having many transgender characters. And sometimes if there is a transgender character, they're not always treated well. Like a decade ago, they always used to be the person on the gurney in a crime show being taken away to a hospital. Gender expression, masculine culture is more dominant. There are lots of examples in sports programming, although Title IX is doing a lot to help women have more rights and more access to services and athletic opportunities. Might be one example. For a project, there's a commercial actually where a woman goes into a car dealership and just like, excuse me, I'd like to buy a car, and people keep walking by her. And then she steps away for a moment, puts on a hat, a mustache, and something else, and comes back like she's a dude and says, in a real deep voice, excuse me, I'd like to buy a big honking truck. And all of a sudden, all these car salesmen show up to help her out. So it was an interesting play on how a lot of times being masculine or being a man might carry a little bit more weight. With sexual orientation, it seems that the dominant culture would be the straight culture or heterosexual culture. A lot of programming is related to marriages between a man and a woman, more are showing opportunities for same-sex couples. Even The Young and the Restless has a lesbian couple on it now. So that is moving around more and more. And as more television and movie platforms are making their own television or sitcom programs or TV programs, like Netflix and Hulu and so on and so forth, there is a lot more representation of a lot more of these people on them. So we're getting to be about 30 minutes. I want to see if we have any questions at this time. Right on. Okay, good. Just wanted to check in. It's okay to ask questions in the Q&A. So I will go to the next slide. And it's like, well, how do you know somebody's transgender? So in this new book, the DSM-5-TR, which was recently published, or at least released to the professional public this year, there are criteria set up, and basically the criteria of a diagnosis in the DSM book have to do with explaining common characteristics or features or complaints that someone might have in their diagnosis. And for gender dysphoria, it has its own chapter. It's not affiliated with any other types of diagnosis. For example, in the depressive disorders chapter, a person might have major depression. They might have I can't say it, dysthymia. Did I say that right? And or they might have depression otherwise specified. So a lot of times it depends on the characteristics, the number of characteristics a person has. So there might be multiple types there's different types of bipolar diagnoses. So under gender dysphoria, it has its own chapter. And the sections have to do with gender dysphoria in children, gender dysphoria in adolescents and adults, gender dysphoria otherwise specified, or gender dysphoria unspecified. And those last two have to do with a person may have one or two of these, but they don't have the full criteria for a diagnosis. The ones shown here, I have adolescents and adults underlined because these are the common criteria for diagnosing an adolescent person, 14 or older-ish, or an adult 18 and older with gender dysphoria. The criteria are a little bit different for children, and I'm not going to speak on those because that's not my area of expertise. But they are widely available if you want to look up gender dysphoria in children in the DSM, and you'll find plenty of explanations of what the criteria are on the internet from Professor Google or your other favorite search engine. So these are the criteria, and I had to shorten it because there wasn't room on the slide to write every single word. So for adolescents and adults, it's basically says that my identified gender and the gender I was assigned at birth are incongruent, or they don't match up. The second one is the individual is dissatisfied with their body related to their sex and gender characteristics, their anatomy, their body, the gender and sex related anatomy. For example, if I wanted to have a nose job, that's not necessarily going to be related to my sex characteristics because most everyone has a nose. That's not really a good example, but it has to do with the body related to the genitalia and the gender characteristics related to that, because it kind of identifies a person's gender. Another criteria is the desire to present as the gender I identify under, with or without medical intervention. There are some people who identify as transgender and they don't start any medical interventions. And what I mean by that, medical interventions have to do with taking a prescription such as a hormone therapy or having surgery. Those are the main medical interventions for someone who identifies as transgender. And I'll talk more about that if you want me to. The next criteria, the desire to be treated as the identified gender. So if me, someone who is assigned female at birth, identifies as male, and I want you to treat me like a guy, I need to let you know that I'm a guy and you need to treat me like a guy. For some people, that's hard to say because there is a lot of fear on how the person I'm telling will respond if they don't accept it. It can be a very difficult place to be. The next criteria, that I would think I have the typical feelings and reactions of the identified gender or as a male if I were transgender. The identified gender. And then the last criteria is very common. The individual expresses significant distress in social situations, including occupational, educational settings, at family, anything that involves basically socializing with other people, other areas of functioning. That it can be a really difficult place to be. It can be very unsafe for a lot of people. There can be a lot of bullying. There can be a lot of misunderstanding and derogatory terminology, or just plain meanness, as I call it. People saying things that aren't really necessary to other people. So when a person, when I'm meeting with somebody to see if I am going to diagnose them with gender dysphoria, I go through questions without being so clinical, and perhaps, and ask them questions along these lines to get an answer from them about where they are in each of these criteria. And my understanding has been that, and I want to check in the TR version, but in the past, a person has had to have at least 4 of these to be identified as with gender dysphoria. Otherwise, they might have gender dysphoria otherwise specified or unspecified. Just, they might be questioning their gender and they're not sure. I have had some people come to me and they just needed a safe space to talk about it. Because there's nobody else I can talk to, and I don't want to be judged, and you don't know anybody I know, so let's talk about it. So there might be people who just need to figure it out. And that can happen. I've had it happen in as little as 2 sessions, and I've had one person I've been talking to for about a year, and they're still not sure. And they're probably going to take a break in a little bit and might come back later. Can be a lot of pressure for some. Are there questions?
We do have a question.
Sure.
Someone asked if you could explain pansexual again, please.
Okay, sure. So pansexual is a sexual orientation. I'll use myself as an example, that I am attracted to a person because of the person that they are. In other words, it's not necessarily related to being male or female, cisgender, and it's not necessarily related to being transgender male or transgender female. I am attracted to a person because of the person they are. It's kind of short, but that's pretty much the answer I have been told, has been explained to me. Okay, I will keep going, and as the questions come up, put them in the Q&A.
So Becky, this is Anne. Can I just ask you to talk a little bit about pronouns?
Sure.
She, her, especially the one that confuses me personally the most is they, when someone chooses they versus she, her, he, him.
Sure, I'm gonna back up a little bit. There we go. So when I meet somebody, pronouns can be very important. And the reason pronouns can be very important is because often somebody will refer to you in the third person with a pronoun. And so my name is Becky. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And sometimes I will put that out there ahead of time. Sometimes I will have it on a name tag. Ooh, there's a fancy button. I have it on my work name tag, and I have it in my email signature, because I don't want someone to feel pressured to have to identify that. And I'm leading up to, I think, the answer to your question. But I want to do a full picture. So when somebody comes to my office, I want to make it a safest space possible, or I want them to feel comfortable. And so I often introduce myself. My name is Becky. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. It's nice to meet you. Let's get started. Tell me more about you. And then they might say, well, hey, my name's John and my pronouns are he, him, and his. Although my name on my driver's license is Jeanette. Whew. But we've usually figured that out if insurance is involved too, because a lot of times if a person hasn't legally changed their name, their birth name will still be on their identifications. So we've probably already talked about it at this point. But pronouns are very important to a person because it helps them know they will be respected. So if a person identifies as a woman, then very often they will say their pronouns are she, her, and hers. If a person identifies as a man, they will often say their pronouns are he, him, and his. When a person is not on the binary or is non-binary, that is when they might use they, them, and theirs. Because they don't identify as she, her, hers, they don't identify as he, him, and his. And so in order to have an alternative, the community themselves as a whole, and over time, trying a few different options, have come up with a few possibilities. So one of them is they, them, and theirs. There are some folks who use ZE, Z, ZEM, ZEM, and ZERS, ZERS, as pronouns that don't designate specific binary gender, male or female. So I think this community, the non-binary community, is still working on this, is still growing, but I think they're pretty much going to be sticking with they, them, and theirs. And appreciate it a whole lot when you respect their pronouns. Most folks I have worked with understand that sometimes it's a big adjustment, but when a person says it in a way that sounds malicious or makes it about themselves, then it can be very frustrating. For example, well, I know you want to go by they, and so I'll try to use they, and so it just it makes it sound like the person you don't. It's not important to point out to the person that this is hard to do, because it is hard to do. It's a hard adjustment, but it's also an even harder adjustment for the person living in their skin to present this to you after they have struggled for years with figuring out who they are and trying to be able to tell somebody that without being laughed at, questioned, disregarded, or not believed. Oh, there's no such thing. And those are the nice things I've heard. When a person is facing a lot of misunderstanding because of myths that are believed, it's really hard to hear that your struggle to say they, them, and theirs is harder than my struggle to be they, them, and theirs. I don't know if that makes sense. Yes, I saw your hand up, Beth.
So we do have a question. It says, what age are you typically seeing the questioning or transgender come out?
Well, I have seen it at a lot of different ages, frankly, anywhere. And often it used to be when back in 2011, 2012, when I started doing gender work, that a lot of people were like, well, yeah, I've known I was a guy, or I've known I was a girl since I was 2 or 5 or whatever. I told my mommy I want to wear dresses, or I don't want to wear dresses, or something that designates gender, really. But what I started seeing a lot of confusion is when puberty sets in middle school, which is hard enough as it is. It's a really tough age. It's really tough when the boys start to smell like onions and the girls, I can't even describe what I was like when I was that age. I was confused. I wanted people to like me. There was just so much going on. And it was a difficult place to be. And on top of that, if you add, hey, I just told my friend, wouldn't it be great if I was a guy? Have you ever thought about being a guy? And they're like, heck no. And it'd be like, oh, me either. So it's just a tough place to be, much less trying to fit in. And then when you're trying to fit in who you really are, who you know yourself to be, and what people tell you you should be, it can be very confusing. It's a very confusing place. So I see a lot of pain, a lot of emotions all over the place in the middle school age. I don't work as much with middle school age, although I've worked with a few 14-year-olds. And it is difficult, but I've also had a lot of people tell me what it was like in middle school. And I think that's probably the hardest age, where there's a lot of questioning. There are a lot of young people who are like, I know who I really am, but then, my faith tells me this. And, oh my God, what do I do? Am I a bad person? Or do I try to figure out who I am? What's going on? So it's difficult at any age. Yes.
So we had somebody just comment that I recently heard they or ver, and you touched on that, but I wanted to let you know that someone had mentioned that in the Q&A. And also we have a question. What is the problem with calling the individual by his or her name, especially if you don't prescribe to their lifestyle? Also, they need to be respected. I also need to maintain my morals too.
Right. That's a really big point that I was probably starting to lean into. And the truth of the matter is, that is something that everyone needs to work out between themselves. I would want to respect someone's wishes the same way that I would want them to respect mine. It's never an easy discussion, and there's not always an easy solution. I would think that there's a lot of layers to this. And I don't mean to disrespect anybody, because while for those who are adults and have young people in their lives who are still figuring it out, there's this kid or this person that's part of my family. They're my flesh and blood. And then here is my faith that has brought me to this point in my life and has gotten me through some of the most difficult things I've ever experienced in my whole life. My faith family, the people in my house of worship, my faith leaders. And so it can be a very difficult place to be to try to balance that out. So when a person says, I want, if you know, I'll use myself again. If I identify as Robert, I know I was born Becky, but I want you to call me Robert. And in considering it like it's a nickname, it is a very simple request that requires some consideration. If the person is in high school age or younger, or maybe even in their young 20s, keep in mind that this is a person that developmentally is still maturing. They are just learning about abstract concepts at the high school level. Things you can't touch, abstract concepts like feelings. And it's hard for them to even identify how they feel sometimes, much less be able to talk about it. So they are still gaining a lot of tools to handle the world, to respond to the world. And I have an opinion about this, but I really believe it's up to every person to figure this out for themselves. Is that if someone wants me to use a nickname, I look at it in that way, that my real name is Rebecca, but please call me Becky. I try to look at it in that way, that when someone comes to me and say, well, I was born Catherine, but I want you to call me Donald. And so during the session, I will always call them Donald out of respect. It helps build the therapeutic relationship. And hopefully helps them see that I respect them so that I can continue a good relationship with them. Yes, Beth.
So someone has made a comment. People often have unique names, especially with as many cultures that inhabit the US. We learn and use unique names and nicknames all the time. Learning to use proper pronouns can be achieved if we see it as a part of their identity and not a part of the identity we place on them.
Mm-hmm. That's a really great point. My parents had plans for me to be a doctor, but I did not become a doctor. A lot of family members have hopes and dreams for their kiddo, but sometimes you got to let the kiddo, or as they become adults, tell you what it is that their hopes and dreams are about. And part of that involves who they are, how they see themselves. Young people who have the support of their families and of friends have a lot more success than those who are not supported. If I may quickly go to another slide, sorry. Oh, there we go. There was a survey back in 2015, and they were about to do another one, but didn't get to it because of the pandemic. But there was a survey done in the United States, which had nearly 30,000 people responding to it who identify as transgender. And while they were all 18 and older, many of them reported on things that happened to when they were younger as well. And one of the most significant statistics is that nearly 41% of the respondents reported that they had attempted suicide in their lifetime, which is nearly 9 times higher than the rate in the cisgender population at 4.6%. 4 out of 10 people basically had attempted suicide, and these are people who had survived their attempt to respond to this survey. There are some who don't respond. When people become despondent, it's important to look out for signs. If somebody's becoming despondent, if they're isolating, if they are turning to substances for relieving their emotions or other behavior that's non-helpful to their future, then pay attention. It may just be somebody needs to be heard, that somebody needs to be supported. It doesn't mean anyone else has to change who they are or what they believe. This group of people is typically underemployed, underhoused, a lot of homelessness in this group of people. In this survey, 30% of respondents had experienced homelessness at some point in their lives. And many had stayed in shelters. Almost 3/4 had stayed in shelters, if they could, if they weren't kicked out or judged or banned simply because of how they identified themselves. Most people who are employed reported being fired, denied a promotion, or experiencing some other form of mistreatment or discrimination related to their gender identity or gender expression. And over 77% of those who were out, or if they were perceived as transgender at any time between kindergarten and 12th grade, they experienced some form of mistreatment, including verbal harassment, being prohibited from dressing according to their gender identity. I understand that can be controversial. Disciplined more harshly than others, or even assaulted by other students. It is a hard way to live. It's even harder when you try to tell people who you are and they don't believe you. And whatever your intentions may be with talking to them about it, you can't control how they hear it, especially based on their level of maturity or if they haven't reached certain levels of maturity, if they don't have the skills or support to manage their emotions and feelings. It can lead to acting out. It can lead to shutting down. It can lead to thoughts about, well, I may as well not be here. It could lead to those thoughts about suicide, or for that 41% who have attempted something. Now, I don't say that everybody you meet who is trans is going to be there. But the statistics, not necessarily these statistics, there are statistics that show that people who are supportive have more happiness and have more success in life than those who are not supported and not believed, for lack of a better word. Yes. Go ahead, Beth.
So we're coming up on time. We've got 2 minutes left. So is there anything else that you wanted to share with our attendees before we have to wrap up?
Yes, some important resources, thank you, have to do with, for a lot of specific reasons or possibilities. Some are local, some are national. PFLAG is a group for parents and friends of folks who identify under the LGBTQ umbrella. They have many publications, including a guide to being a trans ally or a guide to being an ally for gay and lesbian and bisexual people. There are local chapters for PFLAG. You can go to the national website as shown on the slide, pflag.org. And you can look up publications or you can find a chapter. There's one in Concord, Kannapolis. There's one in Charlotte, which also hosts another meeting in Huntersville, as well as a virtual meeting. And there are virtual meetings around the country if you want to go and see what it's like in another area. The National Center for Transgender Equality has information on different types of federal and state policies and self-help guides, for example, as to if your loved one is looking to change their name and gender marker on their identifications, whether it's birth certificate, driver's license. They have a state-by-state guide, as well as a guide for federal identifications like Social Security card. The Charlotte Transgender Health Group is in Charlotte, and you can go on there to look up medical and mental health providers who provide support and services to the trans community for various ages. Time Out Youth is in Charlotte, but there are youth support agencies across the country in large cities to provide a safe space for all of the youth. Time Out Youth serves age 13 to 21. And the Campaign for Southern Equality also is a great place to seek support or report issues in schools or communities. If you have a kiddo in school who's not being treated well and the school isn't offering any support, you can contact Campaign for Southern Equality and report it to them, and they can give you information about what to do. And they also have the Trans in the South directory with lawyers, doctors, mental health clinicians, and a variety of people who can offer services in different parts of the South. So those are just, you can also often go to Professor Google and type in transgender in Cincinnati, because that's where I'm moving to, or something like that. And you can find services in Cincinnati or for youth. There's a lot more out there now than there ever used to be to help those who are seeking it. Those are the main ones I wanted to share with all of you.
That is absolutely great, Becky. I want to thank you very much for sharing your time with us today. I think this is just a really important topic to address. It's out there. I hear a lot of conversation about it. I hear concern about it. And so I'm glad that you're able to share that information. So we did have a few questions in the chat that are kind of more administrative. So will you be sending the PowerPoint out? We will. This session is recorded and we will be posting that information and it will be available to all. We do not provide a certificate for training for these sessions. These are just basically informational sessions, and we appreciate you being here with us. And then somebody asked, are we able to access the resources later, as in what Becky just shared? So those resources are on that last slide deck. And we certainly will be grasping those resources and posting them for members and making sure that they're available. If you want to email me directly, I would be glad to share that. Did you have something, Becky? Okay, if you want to email me directly, I am going to throw my own email out there. Actually, you know what? Let me do this. If you email memberquestions@partnersbhm.org, that is going to come to the member engagement team. And if you specifically would like the resources to support our transgender community that Becky just shared, we will be most happy to share this with you to make it easier for you to grasp those resources. So again, thank you so much, Becky, for being here with us today.
I did want to say one more thing, that if you are a provider, make sure that if someone comes to work with you, make sure you let them know your level of training. Because somebody might be trans looking for a provider who works with bipolar clients. And some people might be looking for a provider who can write letters for them for their gender transition. So if you've never written letters before, that takes a certain level of training. And just make sure they know that. And you can always help them find somebody on the Charlotte Transgender Healthcare Group. And if they're all booked up, they might be able to help you find someone that's not on that list. They might have other providers available.
Really,
but just be honest with them about your level of training. That's all.
Thanks, Becky. All right, so thanks for joining us, and we hope that you will continue to join us. Next month is July, and our guest speaker, I'm racking into my memory right now, I believe is mental health equity. Did I get that right, Beth?
Probably close to the same thing, I would imagine, but it's minority mental health awareness.
Minority mental health awareness. I was close. So that is our topic for July. And later, August, September, we'll be focusing on our Medicaid transformation and how we're moving into full Medicaid transformation December 1st. So that those transitions will start, and in August and September, October, we'll be focusing on that. So again, thanks for joining us, and you all have a wonderful rest of your day. So bye, everybody.